Hello, my friends. My name is Adrian Adams, and I am a keeper for Call of Cthulhu 7th Edition. What is Call of Cthulhu, and how is it different from other tabletop role playing games? And is it a game for me? Let's take Dungeons and Dragons, for example. At the end of a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, you would face off against the dragon, the thing that you have been chasing since day one. Your party has prepared, they have grown, they have delved, they have looted, they have leveled up, and now they will face down this once fearsome dragon, feeling that they themselves are powerful enough to defeat it. And most likely, they do. They save the town, or the realm, or the world, depending on what it is, and they feel good about it. You feel like you have triumphed. You feel as though you have grown, and characters in the world will respond to that. They will shower you with praise and gold and titles. But that's not Call of Cthulhu. At the end of my most recent Call of Cthulhu scenario, the party almost TPK'd. We lost half the party. One person died from fear, basically. His character fell to his knees and started screaming. His hair turned white. His eyes started bleeding. He screamed so long and so hard that the capillaries in his lung began to burst, and he started coughing up blood until he fell over, just a husk, with his face frozen in eternal terror. Another character had found the brain of his long-lost sister still sentient inside of a jar of alien origin, and it was simply too much for him to take. His character, too, needed to be permanently put in, well, indefinitely, put in an insane asylum. If he ever wanted to play that character again, his character would have to undergo actual therapy, and time would need to go by. And if his character came out, he would not be the same person he was at the start of even just that adventure. And the thing about that is that my players loved it. Now, if an ending like that is appealing to you, an ending where maybe you didn't actually accomplish the thing you set out to accomplish, maybe the thing you discovered completely destroys your character, ruins them, puts them in an insane asylum in the 20s, which is not a good thing. If that appeals to you, I think you should be playing Call of Cthulhu. Absolutely. Now, you see, where other role playing games are about growth and overcoming the odds and becoming powerful and kind of getting that, power fantasy is what it is. Um, that's not really what Call of Cthulhu is meant for or really can do. Honestly, the stronger you become in Call of Cthulhu, it's usually a byproduct of discovering some kind of ancient tome that lets you tap into magics that man was never meant to wield. And you pay for that. Your character, the more wise they become, the more they learn about the things that exist beyond this world, the more insane they become. And it's almost impossible for a person to hold on to a character for very long. And yet, the game's been a hit. My group is made up of people who are Dungeons and Dragons fiends. I mean, they just eat it up. And we used Call of Cthulhu, honestly, just as a way to break things up while our DM was getting ready for an adventure in a few weeks. And I took it upon myself. This was something I was very passionate about, and I was a lot like you might be now. I knew I was interested in this, but I wasn't really sure what it was. There didn't really seem to be a lot of really good informational videos out there. Some people would kind of talk about it, but they wouldn't really get into the nitty gritty of what it takes to be a good keeper. If you're clicking on this video, chances are is that you're going to end up being the keeper for your friends. And don't be intimidated, because the rule book for being a keeper is much smaller and a lot easier to understand than the Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons and Dragons. Honestly, you just need to memorize a few key rules and then maybe double check on some rules for specific things that are going to be coming up in that week's adventure, that week's scenario, and you're going to be ready to run this thing. Ultimately, you're here for, I assume, the same reason that I scoured YouTube and the internet, looking for someone to finally give me a great video, something that really explains Call of Cthulhu role-playing. So what makes good Call of Cthulhu role-playing? Well, it is progression. And not progression in the Dungeons and Dragons type. And I'm sorry if that's the one I keep going to, but it's the most common, and I would say that most people who pick up Call of Cthulhu started on D&D. In Dungeons and Dragons, you can measure progression by levels or by rooms in the dungeon. Sorry, I keep losing my light. It's getting darker and spooky. So how do you measure progression in Call of Cthulhu? Well, you do so with atmosphere and tension. Call of Cthulhu is about increasing the dread. You know, everybody hears the quote, and I don't want to have to say it more than this one time in this one video, but H.P. Lovecraft's big quote is something along the lines of the oldest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and most primal fear is fear of the unknown. Whatever. But, it's true. In Call of Cthulhu, you start off, and maybe your first session in the scenario is, in Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to start in a tavern. In Call of Cthulhu, a lot of times you start with either a letter, or you start at a college. Of course, that's not always how it goes, but a lot of great Call of Cthulhu scenarios start with an old professor of something, archaeology usually, or world history, or of the occult, will get a hold of you and your friends because reasons. And he'll say, hey, my buddy went missing. He went to this part of New England over here, and he was supposed to be running some kind of thing. He was looking into the early civilizations that lived in the valley, and, he's gone now. Would you go track him down? I'm too busy. I'm a college professor. And then you and your friends kind of ask around. You learn that he was looking into the first civilizations that lived there because he found some kind of artifact or something, a knife or a mask, and it, as he started learning about it, it was something dealing with that first civilization's old gods, or something with the pantheon of deities that they worshipped or feared. And then that's your hook. That's very interesting. I think we should look into that. And then you arrive in the valley, and maybe there's a little bit of a town there, and things are not quite right in this town. And I'm describing Blackwater Creek. Anyways, as you progress through the story, you should be things should be getting less and less normal. And whereas maybe your characters start off feeling relatively confident, they are still in America, at least usually. There are plenty of globe-trotting adventures. They're still in America. They're not terribly far from home, maybe a couple 100 miles. But realistically, they're not that far from safety. But as the sessions kind of go on, you start to help them realize that maybe they aren't as safe as they thought they were. And part of the thing that people are going to tell you whenever they talk about Call of Cthulhu is that there's a high mortality rate for characters. And that's true. And that is because Call of Cthulhu is and isn't a lot more grounded in reality than other role playing games. The wonderful and the easy thing about running Call of Cthulhu for the first time is that more often than not, your characters are and your players are going to be doing things that they, as people, could realistically do. When you offer these scenarios, these situations and problems to your players and their characters, they have to think in very realistic terms. For example, Chauncey McClure, a simple electrician who worked on the college campus, got drunk in one of the college's trucks and woke up to find himself in an adventure after the party had been contacted by a professor, and the professor told him, you can take one of these trucks and drive out to this mysterious town. Chauncey was passed out drunk in the back, woke up and found himself in the middle of a swamp with no way to get out. About halfway through the scenario, he found himself in the bar, surrounded by cultists, and they began to burn it down. Now, this bar was on a boat in kind of in a bay, so it was on the dock. So they just set fire to the boat, and he was all alone on the boat, and he had to think of ways that a person could realistically get out of there. Sometimes you're going to put players in scenarios that they really don't know how to get out of, and they're going to come up with amazing things to do. Honestly, that whole scene kind of wrapped up with Chauncey grabbing an axe off of the wall and hacking some of these cultists down as he had lured them onto the boat, and they weren't thinking quite right, well, obviously, and they didn't care if they were going to get caught on fire, and he just kind of hacked through them miraculously, and I mean truly miraculously, survived a 3-on-1 encounter, which was insane, but he used his brain. It now takes place in the 20s, so we were dealing with Prohibition at the time. He took some moonshine off the walls, and he was breaking it on the floor at the feet of the cultists, engulfing them in flame, and for, Mythos reasons, these cultists were particularly flammable. But because things are so realistic, they are dangerous. Getting shot with a shotgun can kill you outright. I once had a player of mine try to be funny and fast talk a timber wolf. He didn't have any weapons on him, and he didn't think he had to run. He was used to watching Dungeons and Dragons, listening to the podcasts and stuff like that, and he thought, oh, I'm going to be clever and get out of it that way. And the Timberwolf ended up ripping his throat out, and he died right then and there. That's what happens. Call of Cthulhu challenges your players into thinking realistically about situations. I have to remind players that running is an acceptable thing. My players recently found themselves in a situation where they were in a cabin in the middle of an intense blizzard, and numerous cultists started coming out of the fog. They did not seem to be focusing on the players. They were instead focusing on something else that was inside the cabin. And the players were looking at each other and looking at me, and they were like, how the hell are we going to get this? This doesn't make sense. And I said, guys, there's a back door. And they went, shit, really? I was like, yeah. So what did they do? They burnt the cabin down, and they just ran, and they had to deal with the blizzard. But dealing with a blizzard is a lot more manageable than dealing with 5 crazy cultists. So I keep talking about cultists and weird monsters and these crazy scenarios, but what does a Call of Cthulhu scenario, is what they're called, kind of play like? Well, they are, in essence, usually they're mysteries. you are given a question, not a problem to solve necessarily. Like in Dungeons and Dragons, you are given the goblins have overrun the cave, and the cave is the only place where our miners can go and make the village money. Please save us. In this one, it's, hey, a bunch of miners died in that cave. We went in there and they all just were dead. There were no signs of struggle on them. Everybody's been too afraid to go in there, and the police have been no help. They just said there was a gas leak or something, but the canary was still alive inside that mine shaft. And then you and your friends, the investigators they're called, will go explore and check it out. Now you can kind of break up Call of Cthulhu scenarios into parts. The first part is usually going to be like ask the person who gives you the job. Ask them as many questions as you can, get as much information about the scenario and whatever as you can out of them. Then, afterwards, you're going to usually go from location to location around town or around the area to try to gather as much information about the hotspot as you can. In this example that I'm kind of just making up now, you would look into, well, how long have these mines been around? Are these natural cave formations? What do the first peoples who used to live in the area have to say about these caves? Have there ever been any accidents in them before? And slowly, your players start to put together an incomplete and imperfect picture of what these caves really are in their mind. And a lot of times they won't get all the answers. They can't. And they shouldn't. Players are going to make things up in their heads that are much worse than the things that you could possibly make up. No offense, that's just kind of how it is. That kind of collective fear, that collective imagination is what drives a lot of the tension and anxiety and dread. And those are the things that really make Call of Cthulhu unique and focused. The amount of dread, anxiety, and fear that you can build in Call of Cthulhu is unlike the amount that you can build in any other role-playing game. And it is bliss for players who thrive on that sort of thing. The reason we play Call of Cthulhu is the same reason we watch horror movies, the same reason we love horror movies. It's the same reason H.P. Lovecraft is still popular, and probably more popular now than he has ever been. It's because in the information age, we know just about everything. And if we don't know it, we can figure it out in just a few clicks. But in Call of Cthulhu, what we know and what we can learn is challenged, and it makes us feel like maybe the thing that we thought we had control over, we have no control over, and instead controls us. Look, at the end of the day, Call of Cthulhu is far and away my favorite role-playing game. Absolutely. And I've never even played as an investigator. I've only ever been a keeper. It's something that I think you, especially if you've made it this far into the video, might also fall in love with. So I think you should subscribe to the channel. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, leave me a like, leave me a comment too. Especially in the early stages of this channel, I want to engage with new keepers or players as much as possible. I will try to respond to everyone's questions, and I will try to include answering questions about the game in my next videos. So I just want to say thank you for watching. It means the world to me. We are going to talk about so much awesome stuff. This was the most catch-all kind of generic video about Call of Cthulhu. Upcoming videos are going to focus on how to build tension, or how much information should I be giving my players. How do you deal with this particular situation that arose in my game last week? We're going to talk about all those things. These videos are relatively easy for me to make, and I can pump them out quickly because I love talking about Call of Cthulhu. I am so excited for what we are going to do here. Thank you for watching. Farewell, my friends.